Hello and welcome back to Closely Observed English. Here is another writing feedback video, and again we have C1 Advanced. This is pretty popular, this C1 Advanced. I always thought the B2 first was more popular with students, but I guess these days people aim a little bit higher. And this particular video looks at a report, and we have an interesting one here. So the rubric reads as follows. An international sporting organization has asked your college for information about its students' involvement in sport. As you are class representative, Dr. Katrina O.D., the college principal, has asked you to write a report summarizing your class's attitude to sport. You should provide information about the class's interest in sport both as participants and as spectators, and should suggest at least one way in which the college could do more to encourage students' involvement in sport. Interesting. Okay. A couple of interesting choices in terms of the language here in just the rubric. And it's unusual as well to see a person named Dr. Katrina O.D. I don't know why it's not just your college principal has asked you. Oh well. So let's dive right in, shall we? This report has a title, which is Report on My Class's Attitude to Sport. Then we go into the introduction. As requested, this report relates to my recent research about my class's attitude to sport, giving details about the class's interest in sports and making recommendations regarding strategies by which college could encourage students' involvement in physical activities. Okay, class's actual situation. It is a fact that during the school period, students have too little free time to practice sport, so many of them are forced to leave sports activities during this period and to restart them only during summer. During school, less than half of my class's mates play sports. Many of them just go to the gym once a week. The majority of us do not have physical activity for 9 months. Class's interest in sports. Although many students are forced to stop physical activities during the school period, I should point out that their interest in sports does not disappear. Many of them continue to watch mostly football and basketball matches on TV, or they go to games of local teams during weekends. Ways to encourage students to practice sports. I would seem that reducing after school mandatory courses for extra credits could be a good idea. We all know how they are important, but too many of them exclude the possibility to practice sport, which is very important for teenagers. You may wish to consider also introducing sports activities in the afternoon courses for extra credits, making them an alternative to theoretical courses. And then the conclusion. Taking all these points into consideration, I would recommend to not underestimate sports' importance in teenagers' growth. If only these two measurements will be taken in consideration, I'm sure that students' involvement in sports will easily increase. Okay. Well, the rubric itself was a little bit strange, and that's led to some interesting kind of problems as we go through the content because it's unusual to be talking about the class interest in sport, both as participants and as spectators. That's odd. You would expect that if we're going to be looking at a way to encourage more people to be involved in sport, that would go so far as participation and not being just passive audience. I mean, what's the point? People watch enough sport on TV as it is, I'm sure. Anyway, putting that little complaint aside, and that is not the student's fault, let's take a look at the content. So I'd say that the content is generally covered. We've got something about sport as participants, um, but this is interest in sports, not the sport that they actually do. So a lot of this goes into why they don't involve themselves in sport at school or during the school year. So I think that that could be a mistake because it doesn't leave you anything to talk about in terms of participation. You simply say, apart from the summer when the school isn't, when people aren't at school, for the rest of the time, they don't have time to do any sport. Okay, well, I know that you're trying to set up a negative so that you can solve it in a later paragraph, but you've kind of put yourself in a corner here a little bit. Maybe talk about the interest that they have, but maybe suggest in this, I mean, you can write anything, can't you? Maybe suggest that the students have to practice sports that they don't like. Reminds me of my time at secondary school. I went to a so-called public school, private, and I loved football. Football was my obsession, but the school didn't really do football because it was a posh kind of school. Um, in the winter term, when they had football as an option, was it winter or the spring term? I can't remember. I think it might have been the spring actually, because if you wanted to do football, you were allowed to list your preferences, but to do football, you had to list hockey first. I hated hockey. I didn't want to be chased around the pitch by angry young men holding sticks. So you had to put hockey first. And if the school thought you had any sporting talent, they would put you into the hockey team. Only those like me who had no talent for hockey ended up being pushed into the football. We didn't even have a PE teacher. It was, I think, the geography teacher or even the Latin teacher sometimes who would take these football lessons. They just set up the match and go. It's terrible. So you could have done something along those lines where there is an interest, but it's not satisfied. Not instead of going kind of all out and saying, we just don't have time. So that kind of puts you into a corner, and it means that you can't really develop the message beyond the most basic things, which means that there are, the content points are generally covered, but the target reader is no more than on the whole informed. So I'm going to go for a 3 for the content here. In terms of communicative achievement, it looks like a report. We have headings. We've got all the headings here. Whether or not the conclusion is necessary, I'll leave it for you to decide. Personally, I don't think it adds much. And it also takes up a lot of words, as you can see. Those words could have been better spent elsewhere developing the ideas that you introduce, because now we only have kind of more straightforward ideas. There's not very much in the way of complexity. Complexity of idea is usually expressed through expansion of the idea. You introduce it and you build it a little bit more, and that makes it more complex. The register is generally formal enough. There are a few places where it doesn't quite work. So, for example, here we've got during school, less than half of my class's mates play sports. Many of them just go to the gym once a week. The majority of us do not have physical activity for 9 months. That could have been put into one sentence for a nice long formal sentence, and we could avoid some of the pronoun use there. Otherwise, I think it's generally okay for the register. So I'd say in terms of communicative achievement, we could go for a 3 there. In terms of organization, the text is generally well organized. Each paragraph details one thing, introduces it, doesn't always build it. And because you move so quickly from one point to the next, there's not very much in terms of the structure going between sentences. There aren't very many sentences to do that with. However, what kind of coherent or at least cohesive markers, let me say, there are quite subtle. They're done pretty well. We've got a nice but just there, nice use of a semicolon just there. So that's good. There are little issues. For example, if you look at this part here, so too many of them exclude the possibility to practice sport, which is very important for teenagers. What's very important? The sport, practicing sport, or the possibility, or the exclusion of the possibility. So that's not crystal clear. So I would say, yeah, on the whole, maybe a 3. And then when it comes to the language, there were little problems of word choice and collocations and the way in which ideas are expressed during the text that's going to bring it down a little bit. So So, for example, there was a little bit of kind of reaching for synonyms when they're not necessary. So that would explain this is my class's mates. You could say my classmates or students in my class would be a little bit more formal. I think we've got there are a few other places where that sort of thing happened. And then just some of the way that we talk about this not being able to do things. So you've got they are forced to leave sports activities. There's a better way to talk about that. Students are forced to stop physical activities. Yeah. Many of them continue to watch mostly football. So restructuring that would help. So many students do indeed watch matches on TV, mostly football and basketball, or they attend local team matches at the weekend, something like that. So this kind of brings it down to around about 2. So overall, not a disaster by any means. We're very close to a passing grade, I would say. And I might have been a bit harsh in some of the areas here. People might argue against my analysis and my overall mark scheme in the comments if they wish. I'm happy for that to happen because this is, for me, quite a subjective task anyway. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I'm not trained by Cambridge in doing this. I'm using the resources that Cambridge have made available to the best of my abilities, but those abilities do have a ceiling, so to say. So what do we learn from this part? We do have to be careful about putting ourselves in a corner, essentially. In the stress of the exam, you do want to set yourself up to being able to have something to say later. Yeah. So it's understandable that the candidate has gone this way and made the current situation, not the actual situation, but the current situation. Actual is a false friend in a lot of languages compared to English. But the candidates put themselves in a corner here by saying that students just don't have the time to do any sports. That's going to make it difficult to expand on the first content point, which is to provide information about the class's interest in sport as participants. You know, even if the school doesn't have doesn't leave the possibility of people taking part in sport, you could still say that many students have expressed an interest in starting sports teams at the school, and they would like a meeting with the principal to discuss this, blah, 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 something like this. So there are issues there. I would kind of go for the middle road. Give yourself something to talk about for every content point. Don't put yourself in a corner with the first one so that you do have something later. And always think carefully about whether or not you need a conclusion in your report. The conclusion here is really talking about how to encourage students so that they do engage in sport more. Not so much that they practice sports, but we're talking about engagement here, really, aren't we? Interest rather than practice itself. And if you do include a conclusion, be careful of the wording. So we've got a problem here with recommend to not underestimate. And we've got this, if only these 2 measurements will be taken in consideration. I've not looked at this in very much detail because I've kind of ignored the conclusion by and large, but there are issues here that the student would want to look at. But overall, yeah, I think there's a lot here that can provide the foundation for a good piece of writing. And I think that with a bit of work, you can take it to the next level. So on that note, thank you and see you next time.